Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School in collaboration with Bloomberg Law. I'm your host, Felicia Lynn. In our episode today, we'll be discussing the nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the U.S. Supreme Court and how the makeup and balance of the court might evolve during the Trump administration. We're pleased to be joined by two guests today. First, Stefanos Bibas, a professor of law and criminology and the director of the Supreme Court Clinic here at Penn Law. His latest book is The Machinery of Criminal Justice from Oxford University Press. Also joining us from Arlington, Virginia, is Kimberly Robinson. She's the Supreme Court reporter for Bloomberg Law. Thanks for joining us. Let's start with you. What do we know about Judge Gorsuch, and what are your thoughts on his nomination?
Well, Neil Gorsuch is brilliant. He clerked at the Supreme Court. He went to Harvard Law School, had a Marshall Scholarship, and he earned a reputation as one of the smartest, best judges in the country. He also hasn't issued any rulings on any real hot-button issues. He hasn't had any cases involving abortion or gay marriage or anything like that. He's probably best known for his concurring opinion in the Hobby Lobby case, taking a strong view of religious liberty, but it's the position the Supreme Court ultimately adopted, so he's in the mainstream, not outside of it. He's a very difficult nominee to oppose on his own ground, though of course there is the question of people's bad blood or feelings after Merrick Garland was held up for 10 months, and that's really where the fight is going to be, not over Gorsuch himself.
And Kimberly, what are your thoughts on his prospects for confirmation? What are you hearing in D.C.?
Well, Neil Gorsuch will likely be the next Supreme Court justice, and that's because Senate Republicans have a majority. And so even though traditionally a Supreme Court nominee has needed 60 votes in order to get through the Senate, there's some indication that if there's a lot of fight from Senate Democrats, that Senate Republicans might do away with the filibuster, often called going nuclear, and that there may just have to be a majority vote in order to confirm Supreme Court justices, including Neil Gorsuch. So I'm confident that Neil Gorsuch will be on the Supreme Court bench. It's just a matter of how dirty the fight is.
And Stefanos, what happens if the Democrats decide to give this nomination the same treatment that Merrick Garland's nomination was given, and the confirmation process drags on much longer than it's expected? How does the court function in that situation?
Well, obviously, the difference is who controls the Senate, but if Democrats succeed in dragging this out, the court has been managing for now on 4-4 cases. It's been finding narrow ways to dispose of cases. It's been kicking a handful of cases down the road, waiting until there's an eventual ninth nominee. Now, some of the cases last year, they just kicked it back to the lower courts to wait for them to come back. This year, they've pushed 3 or 4 cases to April that would have been heard earlier. And it's up to the court. The court could decide it's going to push the cases over to next fall if it needs to or wants to. But for the most part, the Chief Justice seems to have succeeded in finding some narrow grounds, procedural grounds on which most of the court can agree to get rid of it. But we wouldn't then expect to see a big blockbuster ruling on a closely contested issue like the Trinity Lutheran religious liberty case that's before the court this term.
So for those of us, our viewers who are not lawyers, what happens when the Supreme Court is evenly divided in a 4-4 split?
Well, the Supreme Court ruling doesn't create any precedent. It just says, in this particular case, we're going to leave alone the judgment that was decided by the lower courts, but we're going to wait until we have an odd number of justices and have a tiebreaker. So a 5-4 ruling would set precedent for all future cases, but not a 4-4 ruling.
Kimberly, what are some of those key cases where we have seen a 4-4 ruling? And what big cases might be coming up?
Well, I think most notably, we saw the court split evenly in a case over then President Obama's immigration executive order, which deferred deportations for certain immigrants who had come to the country illegally and who were parents of U.S. citizens. So the court was evenly split in that case, and that actually ended up pretty much sounding the death knell for that immigration plan. But we also saw a couple of cases where the court split 4-4 last term, leaving inconsistencies in the law, so that the law meant one thing in one circuit and one thing in another part of the country. This term, the court has deflected, taking a lot of cases where they might be evenly split. Having said that, though, there are a few where we can see that the votes will probably be close in cases before the court this term. In March, the justices will hear a case about the use of transgender or the use of bathrooms by a transgender high school student, and that has the potential to split the court evenly. However, the court is talking about that hot button issue in kind of the most lawyerly way it can in agency deference. So it may be that the court can avoid an evenly split decision even in that controversial case.
Stefano, during this presidential election, we really heard that the stakes were multiple Supreme Court justice openings. If another Supreme Court justice retires, who else might be waiting in the wings here? Sure.
Well, there are 3 justices who are at or close to retirement age. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 83, Anthony Kennedy is 80, Stephen Breyer is 78. And there's speculation that if Ruth Bader Ginsburg were to retire, that President Trump might be looking for a female justice to replace him. And the leading names that have been tossed around for that have been Diane Sykes on the 7th Circuit and Joan Larson on the Michigan Supreme Court, who's a former clerk to Justice Scalia. If it were Justice Kennedy to retire, there are a couple of former Kennedy clerks who've been mentioned, Ray Kethledge on the 6th Circuit, and possibly Brett Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit. There are a few other people who were kind of runners-up for this last nomination who might also be considered. Tom Hardiman on the 3rd Circuit in Pittsburgh, and Amul Tapara, a district judge in Kentucky, who would be the court's first South Asian justice.
And if Judge Gorsuch is confirmed, do you have any sense ideologically where President Trump might be looking for his next nominee?
Well, President Trump has made campaign promises to nominate a justice in the mold of Justice Scalia or Thomas. He's has a series of advisors around him, including the vice president, the White House counsel. He's consulted with the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. So a lot of people who broadly understand themselves to be originalists, making the law, not making up the law, but applying the existing law. But that's a very broad classification. Some of the people on his lists have been more kind of economic libertarians, a little more aggressive judicial review. Others are more traditionally restrain, let Congress not interfere much with what Congress decides to do. But in terms of the names that are floating around on these short lists, the bulk of them look very well qualified. 1 or 2 of them have been pretty outspokenly controversial, but the bulk of them would be pretty hard to oppose on their own merits as opposed to based on what happened with Merrick Garland or arguments about how this will change the balance of the court. But that's all guesswork, and it's as much a political fight as a legal one.
Sure. Kimberly, I just want to note, President Trump has made some disparaging remarks about federal judges that have ruled against his executive orders of late. That gives us some insight into how the president is going to try to influence public opinion. But do we have any hints about what legal strategies the White House might use when trying to deal with what they believe are adverse judicial decisions?
Well, the president made those comments in a case dealing with his controversial immigration executive order, also known as a travel ban or Muslim ban. And in that case, the administration says they're not taking anything off the table, anywhere from fighting it out in the district courts and fighting it out in the Supreme Court. So they're going to keep their options open. We have seen some pushback from Democrats and Republicans, as well as Donald Trump's own Supreme Court nominee, about the language that or personal attacks on the judiciary. But Donald Trump is known for speaking his mind. I don't really think that those kinds of comments are going to be the end.
It's certainly something to keep a close eye on. Thank you both for joining us for this interesting discussion. And thank you for joining us on Case in Point.